Today, what does Glass-Steagall really mean? Hello again, I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And today I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the CEC, and we're going to discuss what Glass-Steagall really means. Hello Robbie, good to see you again.
Thanks Martin, good to see you.
So you guys have been all over Glass-Steagall for quite some time, and of course we've got this limited window of opportunity perhaps around the Royal Commission and a couple of other things. So, but my observation is a lot of the discussion is relatively historical. You know, this is how it happened and this is why Glass-Steagall is important, or high level about it's separating bits of the banks. But what I'd like to try and do today is to go a little bit further into what would this look like? What would these changes actually represent in the Australian context? And perhaps explore again why we think it's so important now.
Yeah. Well, I think the first point to make is that for the consumers, most people watching this show, a Glass-Steagall separation of our banks won't look much different than now straight away. There will be long-term changes, but the reason it won't be that radical a change for the consumers is because the part of the banking system we use, right, is commercial banks. Everyone has to have a bank account. I mean, there may be a few hermits that don't, but majority of people have to have a bank account, and we use it for the payment system, right? So we put our money in there for safety, and we use it to help make payments. That's how we use banking. That's commercial banking. So what's important for us won't change very much immediately. There'll be quite significant changes behind the scenes, but it's not a radical change for the public. When I say long term, I think over time, a Glass-Steagall separation will mean that you can go back to having a lot more commercial banks, right? None of this rubbish where you need 4 pillars to prop up the whole financial system and all that kind of thing. Glass-Steagall provides that security. And then you can, and of course, the more local your bank is, right, the better equipped it is to serve you and the better service you'll get. So you will see that kind of, I think, change over time. But short term for the public, you're going to have the same relationship with your banks. It's what happens behind the scenes that's going to be the most significant for the economy.
And it's worth saying, isn't it, that commercial banking includes holding deposits. It includes making loans and running credit cards and those things. So all of the meat and potato operations of banking that we see today would essentially continue. But the difference is that we are sort of peeling out some of those high risk activities that currently are welded in to core banking, right? And essentially things like derivatives, insurance, and some of those other functions, all of which has a completely different risk profile relative to the meat and potato banking. And the problem we've got at the moment is if one of those more speculative activities, so for example, if the derivatives market internationally crashed, that would have a direct impact on the banks that we know in Australia today because they are exposed to that derivative sector.
Well, something like 2/3 of our bank's derivatives are with clearing houses and overseas counterparties. So right there, and you may have picked up on this yourself, since we've had this clearinghouse phenomenon, that was the main reform of derivatives after the financial system, well, the experts have said, well, all we've done is shifted the risk into the clearinghouses, right? So there's no way, if there's that kind of derivatives problem, it won't blow back on our banks. And so, we cut those out. Now, I think there's two layers to that, Martin. There's the vertical integration question and the horizontal integration question. I hate using those jargon terms, but that's the language used in Australia. So for a lot of people, products like insurance are also normal products, but I want to just make an obvious distinction. Where, as I said before, you have to have a bank account or you virtually have to have a bank account, you don't have to have insurance, right, per se. I mean, it's advisable to have insurance, but straight away you're getting into where it's more about choice that you want to make that's best for you, and you're going to do better if you shop around, etc., to do that. Well, what's happened with these mega universal banks that we've got, or integrated banks, is you get shunted into their insurance company, right? Or you get shunted into their financial advice business, their wealth management business. These are fairly normal products, normal businesses, but again, because they're things that you should decide after thinking it through. Do I want that? Do I need that product? Do I need that product? There's one of the interesting observations. The only good thing that Treasury in Australia has ever said about banking separation, and they said it to the Royal Commission. They made a concession in one of their submissions a few months ago. These ongoing submissions they do. They did point out that if the system was separated, those products would be, for some people, more expensive than they are now because they're cross-subsidised by deposit-taking banks. So while they'd be more expensive, on the other hand, that expense means people would make wiser decisions thinking, well, do I really need that after all? Right? Whereas at the moment, the bank just shunts them into a product, tells them they need it, etc. So that will be a difference for the consumer as well. And the Treasury admitted, as other experts have admitted, for a lot of this problem from vertical integration of people being put on a production line and pushed through the different businesses of the bank, is they've been persuaded to buy products they actually, in a lot of cases, haven't even needed, right? And so they buy a product they haven't needed, and they sometimes the product goes bad and it ruins them. So that will be a change. So that's the level that the consumer will feel. The investment banking stuff, as you know, you looked at the derivatives question as well that we've been highlighting for years. In fact, I did my first ever tally of Australian bank derivatives back in 1994. we produced a chart back then, 1994. Look how much higher the derivative. Back in those days, they were only in the billions still, hadn't hit the trillions yet, right? But they were always dwarfed the assets and liabilities and deposits of the bank. So that's where there will be significant differences. Now, the way I think of it is, if deposits cannot be used to collateralize that kind of activity by the banks, which is effectively what happens when the banks have deposits, and mix it with investment banking, then well, that's safer for deposits, of course. It means there's going to be less of that kind of activity, and that can't hurt anybody, right? Glass-Steagall is a brake on speculation. Now, again, I think there's two types of there's two levels to the speculation. There's the stuff the banks can do between themselves, which is just really crazy, right? The paper they shuffle back and forth like derivatives. But when those derivatives relate to other areas, like in Australia, most of the derivatives in some way would relate to the loans the banks are issuing into the housing market, right? They've got all these interest rate swaps, etc. That kind of trading can allow the bank to engage in a secondary speculation in an area of the economy that does affect us, right? Suddenly, because they can make so much money, not just lending on the property, but trading on those loans, then they want to lend more and they want to lend more. And what happens in the real world to us? Prices start going up and up and up. You spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of time focusing on the consequences of the crash. What's the consequences of how we've had to live for the last couple of decades, dealing with increasingly unaffordable housing? Why should we think of housing in that way, as you said on your show the other night, right? It's a place to live. No. Yet it's become increasingly unaffordable. There's lots of social problems already from that. We've got to understand it's already damaged our economy. So that you can stop the speculation in areas that we might not think affect us, but in the areas that absolutely do affect us. That's what this will help do as well. And
it's worth then sort of just clarifying that. What we're saying is that effectively the bank's ability to magic money out of nowhere, right, and leverage all of those derivatives and those international funding channels will get crimped. So effectively their capacity to lend will actually be less than it is today. And what that means is, because as home prices are directly linked to the availability of credit, if credit is going to be a little bit more crimped, that's going to put a cap on home price growth. And because we've got such extended ratios in Australia at the moment, and everyone you look at, it's just crazy, we'll get back to a more normalised relationship between credit and home prices. So whilst the correction process will probably take some time and will be painful, actually it's the long-term interests of the country to take the speculative element out of the housing sector by limiting credit availability.
Yes, and then the good side, the other good side of that is, while there's an overall limit on credit, that's relative to this crazy bubble lending that we've seen, right? It's actually, there will be more credit, arguably, and I think you can prove it, available for the real economy.
Yep.
Right? So, yes, shock horror, we may have to go back to actually being able to afford a home before we can buy it. But if house prices come down, they will be more affordable. But put that aside, that's a good thing to be able to afford a home before you buy it, right? There's nothing wrong with that. There's programs, if the government wants, if governments say, oh, we should do something, well, they should build affordable housing. That's a totally legitimate role for the government to do. None of this, I get sick of, I hate the term market mechanism. We're going to come up with we're going to incentivize the market to do this rubbish. That's where a lot of this rubbish comes from. Just do it. Go ahead and do it. Yes, we used to do it. That's affordable housing, right? The credit, though, that's part of the banking system, the real banking system that we're all part of, can stay in the real economy, and small businesses, entrepreneurs, small manufacturers will find again that, the banks want to lend them money, right? Because they want to do something with this money. What happens as a result of that? Well, there's more jobs, there's more income, right? There's a lot of, not to go off on a tangent too much, but there's a lot of discussion in the world at the moment about inequality, all these things. People talk about how we used to have a much stronger middle class, the hollowing out of the middle class, right? All these questions are related, right? You don't have to be a socialist you don't have to come up with a socialist solution to getting rid of inequality. Let's go back with a properly functioning banking system. You once again have a strong middle class, right? And it's not hollowed out, and the inequality question takes care of itself. You have a strong middle class, you have a stronger economy.
Yeah, and the rebalancing of lending towards more productive outcomes, particularly those relating to, helping businesses to grow and to create more growth and therefore more momentum in the economy, is a very good thing, because at the moment many businesses aren't able to get the funding that they need, despite the fact they've got legitimate business plans and all the aspirations to grow. They just cannot get the money, and that's because the banks say, well, actually, I've got this $100, I can lend it to somebody over there for a house, or I can lend it over there for a business. And for them, they actually make a whole lot more money off lending it for housing, because the credit risks are different, but also the capital ratios are different, right? So basically, the way that the banking supervisionary structures work, it actually encourages the wrong behavior from the banking system as well. Yep. So this is all trying to sort of get it back to a more central position where effectively we've got productive lending for productive purposes. And that is a really, really important change. And there's another angle here, is ultimately what you probably want to do is to bring the total pool of lending back more to the pool of deposits that's actually available in the market. So effectively, rather than just being able to extend the size of the banks ad infinitum, so that the more that you can run derivatives and raise funding overseas, you can just grow and grow and grow and expand to become ever more part of the economy. You're then putting the banks back into their position as an enabling capability to enable the broader economy to go. And that's the critical sort of philosophical change, right? What it does mean is that banking then ceases to be such a critically large component of the total economic activity in the country. It gets put back in its box, right? And that's the thing we have to, I think, bear in mind here as we think about some of these changes.
Oh, absolutely. It's called financialization, what's happened to the economy. And it's just, instead of banking being a service to the economy, it's become a profit generator in its own right. And from what? The public has, like the small business people, the banks won't lend them money unless they're lending against a house, right? And then, it just goes pear-shaped. The small business ombudsman, Kate Carnell, has gone to war with the banks over this question because of this fact. I think I'd like to point out, further to our last discussion about China dare I say it, there's an interesting story about China and Glass-Steagall, because I think most reasonable people would recognise, sorry about that, Martin, that China, was a very closed system, and then in the 80s it decided, look, we have to let market principles work in the economy, have some kind of a free market here, so that people, and it's been very successful, right? The success of China is amazing. Well, in trying to figure out the best way to do this, in the early 90s, China looked at the leading economies of the world, around 1993, and said, well, actually, one feature of like the American financial system is it's got this separation of commercial banking and investment banking. Well, we're going to have that. So they instituted that in 1993. Around 2007, there was an internal debate in China. The world seems to have moved away from that. Do we need to? Maybe we should. And there was a lot of discussion. Let's move away from that separation itself. While they were talking about it, the global financial crisis happened. And China said, okay, enough with that. We're happy with what we've got. Thank you very much. And so China actually has this separation. And it's an important thing to bear in mind when you hear the worries that people express about China's credit and whatever. There's a lot of it for sure, but China's a big economy. There has been this natural break in China on that has tended to direct credit into mainly productive areas. It's never perfect, but it's a very different system than the Western world. And one of the signs, I think Australia's derivatives are like, we've got 100 times the derivatives that China has for a much smaller economy. That's a pretty strong indicator of how that actually translates into the Chinese economy. So that's the sort of thing that's worth. There's a real live example right there, right? That it works. There's another Asian example I'd like to give too, because we're talking about this in the more general terms, but I think we have to acknowledge that getting Glass-Steagall in will in the Australian context is in relation to probably a very serious bust in our financial system. That's what we really feel we're heading into on the back of this. Every day it's more alarming about the property market. And it just seems where the property market goes, the banks will have to go with it, like in Ireland, etc. And you've been discussing that. Well, in 1999, there was a banking crisis in Japan on the back of 98, 99. And the banks had got into trouble with derivatives, the Japanese banks, big trouble with derivatives that they were being sold by US banks. The deputy director of the Ministry of Finance of Japan is a friend of mine. We brought him to Australia in 2014 to talk to members of Parliament about Glass-Steagall. He was able to step in over a weekend and sort out this derivatives crisis in the Japanese banks in a way that stopped it from becoming a global contagion. Right, very successful. Cancelled the derivatives of the banks, etc. over a weekend. Japan had Glass-Steagall at that time. Right, it's very important to understand that framework made this intervention they did possible and much more successful, right? So there's that's an example where in a crisis it showed its value in that way as well. We need to be mindful. That's probably going to be something here. What we've got here, we've got a bill in Parliament, as you know, the Banking System Reform Separation of Banks Bill. What we've done is we've taken the original Glass-Steagall Act that was passed in the United States. There's a bill in the US now, the Congress now, which is called the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act. That's an updated version of the same bill to reflect the modern financial system like derivatives, etc. We've taken those bills, we've applied them to the Australian context with a lot of detail. The biggest section relates to APRA, our bank regulator, and really reining it in, bringing it under much tighter control, right? And that bill, the very best thing we could do now ahead, before a crisis, is get that bill passed through Parliament. So there was a notice of motion in the Senate today on the importance of breaking up banks. Pauline Hanson moved it. The Greens supported it wholeheartedly. The Centre Alliance supported it wholeheartedly. The other crossbenchers supported it. The government made a statement saying it opposed it, but we know there are individual Liberals who support Glass-Steagall absolutely. The Labor Party made a statement, not that it's opposed it opposed the bill. The Labor Party said it opposed um, uh, the motion because it wants to wait for the outcome of the Royal Commission. So that's Labor playing dead on this or hedging its bets or whatever. Usefully, though, Senator Barry O'Sullivan, one of the government senators, a national, one of the main drivers for the Royal Commission, he crossed the floor and voted for the motion for banking separation. And he'd given a speech yesterday in the Senate about the banks and the Royal Commission saying, look, these banks have to go back to just being banks. And so he put his money where his mouth was. He voted against his own party for this motion. So that is, look, the pressure is on in Parliament. We've put the pressure on, and people just need to know that there's a lot of value, there's a real benefit to this. It's very hard to argue against it, actually. I don't actually, you know what, Martin, I do not get arguments against it, except deflective arguments like, oh, that's an American thing, or whatever.
Well,
right?
the only argument that they would say is market freedom. The banks should be able to be allowed to do anything to maximise their profits, to maximise their return to shareholders. That's the free market line is the only line that I see, right, as being the only reason why you would actually resist this. But as we said, that means you're allowing the banking system itself to get bigger and bigger and bigger and occupy more and more of the economy. And we know where that leads. It leads to asset bubbles. It leads to higher risks. It leads to less ability to get finance. All the stuff that we've seen over the last decade. So
that paradigm, the paradigm, if I can use that word, behind that argument, that's gone.
Yep.
The world has changed dramatically in the last 10 years on that.
Yep.
Governments don't get away with that argument anymore.
No, indeed. And it's worth just thinking about this. We've been talking the last little while about bail-in and, the risk to deposits. And the fact of the matter is that the biggest risk to the banking system in Australia in the short term is probably to do with the international financial system and the derivatives relative to the overlending that's here locally, right? So effectively, you could see a scenario where, given the mega banks we've got here, they could actually get hit over the head with a 4x2 from the derivatives sector, suddenly find they're in great difficulty, and then that triggers a bail in the deposit. So it basically crosses from the investment sector into the core banking system, right? Okay. Which again is why we need to tease this apart, because this is a way of further ring fencing the commercial banks and the deposits that people actually hold with them. And that's why this is important, because essentially we know that there are lots of risks in the system, as we've been talking about on the DFA channel over quite a long period of time now, and the risks are getting more extensive. This is a mechanism to help begin to normalise and address some of these risks. And there's a window of opportunity, as you've clearly highlighted. We know that the Royal Commission is thinking about some of the more strategic options. We know that there's a limited window to be able to put a submission into the Royal Commission to argue for, a different model. So I guess, point one, it's worth actually making that step and just saying banking separation is a really critical thing. Glass-Steagall is something that should be considered, right? That's pretty much all you need to say, I guess. And then the second thing is, because the Parliament is now, I think, awake to this issue, and we know that there are a number of individuals within the two houses, who are actually sensitised to it, there's also an opportunity to directly influence politicians, So again, email them, send them a letter, and basically just let's build the pressure as best we can to get this to move forward, because it is a really critical question.
Well, people can go to the media releases section on our website, cecos.com.au, and we do very regular updates on this. There's some media releases up there now on making submissions to the Royal Commission on two issues. Glass-Steagall, he asked for submissions on banking separation, right? So he wants it, give it to him. It's probably easier to find the link on our website than on the Royal Commission website. It's a bit awkward to find their online submission page, but you just click on that link and you write it on the screen and just hit submit, right, and you're done. And also, as John Adams pointed out on your show, the Treasury said to a person concerned about bail-in, well, make a submission to the Royal Commission. So you may as well make it about both, right?
Yep.
Because the issues are related. What Glass-Steagall, one of the facets of it is it prioritises the protection of deposit. That's how you do it. It doesn't just say it. It organises the financial system to make sure it happens. So if you the takeaway from Glass-Steagall is you get a Glass-Steagall system, you can once again trust your bank, right? Because you can trust that your deposit will be secure, which is the main reason you use a bank. You can trust that the bank has no vested interest in sending you down the garden path on something that's going to lose your money, right? They can give you free financial advice to say, look, you need that product here, here's what we suggest you do. But that's not their business model. That's just them being a good giving you good service, right? Trust is the cornerstone of the banking system. Glass-Steagall bring it back. So this is it's the ultimate no-brainer, I reckon. What will happen if the Royal Commissioner gets a lot of submissions on this, and the submission deadline is Friday next week, the 26th at 5 p.m. Right, and I really urge people, don't put it off and go, it won't make a difference. It will make a difference. Let's flood it. He's going to get a lot of lobbying from the banks not to break them up. A lot. I can assure you, a lot. They're a very powerful lobby. They are the most powerful lobby, arguably. He's going to get a lot of that. He needs to have a live sense from the public that the public want this, right? That'll help balance that banking side, which is already discredited in his mind. And if I don't think it's necessary for him to we will still fight for Glass-Steagall whether he comes out and recommends it or not. We're not even sure he's going to go that far, whether he thinks it's in his terms of reference. But if he does come out and recommend Glass-Steagall, recommend a breakup of the banks, that's dynamite, right? Australia might end up going somewhere fast that no other jurisdiction has done since the global financial crisis because the banks have been so strong in lobbying against it. We might set the scene here, and there were articles in the Financial Times in London back in March when the Royal Commission first started saying, oh no, look what Australia's done. They've got an inquiry into the banks. Look what's coming out of it. If they're starting to talk about breaking up the banks, that may reignite the conversation here, right? The global bank fraternity are looking at what's happening in Australia. So this has implications. We should see it as an opportunity. We've got a window of opportunity. Let's seize it.
No, absolutely. And I think it's just to underscore one other thing, we know from the Royal Commission that trust in banks and bankers is an all-time low, right? And there's been a few empty words being, mouthed off by the banks at the moment. Oh, well, we'll change, we'll address our culture, et cetera, right? That's all very fuzzy, right? But This actually gives a foundation effectively to drive a behavioural change inside banking to bring banking back to support the broader economy and everyday Australians. So this is effectively a better route to restoring trust in the banking system. That you're not trusting their behaviour.
Exactly. You don't have to trust their behaviour. Of course, you're always going to get a crooked bankers and good bankers, but you shouldn't have to trust that. You've got a structure you can trust. You go into that bank. That bank is not connected to anything that might be dangerous to your money. That's how it works. That's all the majority of the public need to know. It's easy to police and almost impossible to game. That's the beauty of Glass-Steagall. If you're a free marketer, like there's a former ANZ director, John Dawson, who's on the FPA, he's a free marketer. He loves it for free market reasons. It's not an onerous regulation. It's not hard. Like once the separation's there, right? It doesn't require all these lawyers to interpret stuff and whatever. It's actually cheaper for the banks. Right? He says it's in there. It's good for their shareholders if they do this. Right? So he has that argument. There's other arguments more on the economic justice line. Get those crooks away from my money, kind of thing. And they're all valid arguments. They're all real. So it's why and they didn't repeal Glass-Steagall in 1999, Martin, because it didn't work. They repealed it because it did work. It was stopping this derivatives lobby in the banks. Right, they're really getting carried away by 1999, and it was stopping them everything they wanted to do. Sandy Wheel, who was the head of Citigroup, or became the head of Citigroup, head of Travellers Insurance, that was given credit for repealing it. He had set a record on Wall Street for executive salary, something like $200 million in 1997 or 98. Right, he was the ultimate high-flying banker. Got Glass-Steagall repealed, no holds barred. In 2012, he came out and said, we were wrong to do that. We need to get it back. What we did was a catastrophe because he recognised what happened in the 2008 crisis, So learn from their mistakes. Let's It's proved to be the most successful banking regulation in history. Let's go to it.
Yeah, Robbie, thank you very much. Well, I appreciate your time today, and I hopefully that's cast a little more light on the subject and how to think about it, because it's not necessarily straightforward, but at its essence, there is a very simple opportunity, right, to effectively split out the risk-related stuff from core banking, and Glass-Steagall is potentially the way to go. So we'll try and put a couple of links below in terms of where to find more information. And, there is a window opportunity that I think is worth exploiting. So thank you for your time, Robbie. We'll talk again, I'm sure.
Thanks, Martin.